Welcome everyone to the Global Disability Inclusion webinar, The State of Disability Employment Engagement. Understanding 15 to 20% of your employee population. Your speakers for today's program are Meg O'Connell, founder and CEO of Global Disability Inclusion, and Peter Rutigliano, PhD, senior principal at Mercer. Audio cast quality is subject to your equipment, available bandwidth, and internet traffic. If you experience unsatisfactory audio quality, please use the telephone dial-in option provided in your confirmation and reminder emails. If you have dialed in, operator assistance is available by pressing #. You can send questions at any time by using the Q&A box to the left of the presentation screen. That's the one with the question mark. All you have to do is type your message at the bottom of the pop-up box and then press enter to send it. A question and answer session will follow the presentation. And now I will turn the call over to our speakers. Please begin.
Great, thank you so much, Luke. Well, welcome everybody. My name is Meg O'Connell, and as the introduction said, I am the CEO and founder of Global Disability Inclusion. And today we're really excited to present with our friend Pete Rutigliano, who is at Mercer, the data that we have been studying for 10 years, and that is disability employee engagement. And we truly believe the findings that we have uncovered and some of the strategies and tools that we have put into place are really creating the next frontier for disability inclusion. We have spent a lot of time over the last several years in our work talking about infrastructure supports and preparing the workplace for people with disabilities, but we haven't spent so much time talking about the employee experience of those with disabilities. So that's what we're going to jump into here today. We're excited. This truly is a global call. We had registrants from all over the world: Nigeria, the Philippines, Australia, South America, Canada, Mexico, Ireland. So welcome to everybody from around the world who's joined us for this conversation. Pete, I'd love to turn it over to you to just provide a few more context and intro about who you are and why you're excited about today.
Yeah, sure. So my name is Pete Rutigliano. I indeed work for Mercer, which is a company that's within the larger MMC, Marsh McLennan. I've been doing survey work for about 25 years now, and that's where a lot of this research comes from. Most of my research around surveys are your standard employee engagement surveys, and we've been able to really dig into some of the experiences for employees with disabilities. So I'm really excited to get started.
All right, let's jump in. So likely all of you on this call are familiar with organizational engagement surveys, but from time to time we do have a few people that this concept is new to them. So we just wanted to set the stage on why they're so beneficial for companies and why companies are eager for this data and this information about their employee population and their experiences at work. So first, engagement surveys help the organization to assess their workplace programs, right? You spend a lot of time and money and effort to really make sure that your workplace is open and inclusive and you have great policies and programs for your employees. So this really enables the company to understand how various populations within the company are impacted by the varied policies, programs, or procedures. So it really gives them that firsthand information of how employees are responding to what they're doing. It also helps drive strategy and development. With every survey, there are quick wins for companies because they're identifying gaps in programs, and it's really the impetus for change. And we know companies take some of those quick wins that they find from their engagement surveys and are able to create some quick changes. But we also know that engagement surveys really devise a 3 to 5 year strategy for companies, because a lot of changes are cultural and climate changes, so those take time and they aren't going to be quick wins. There's also benchmarking that can be done, so you understand where you are as a company or an organization and how you compare with your peers, either in your industry or within a specific region that you're located. And it's a way to get some real data from your employees. A lot of times we find our employees tend to be PC. They don't like to deliver bad information or bad results of how they're feeling about programs. So sometimes you get the sugar-coated version. Well, engagement surveys really allows for employees to have that forum where they can be anonymous and provide really open and honest feedback. So that's why companies really get excited about engagement data.
Yeah,
Pete, anything you want to add here?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, one thing I'd want to add on that is specifically that having the data in terms of numbers is really critical. It's unfortunately, we're not, as humans, we're not very good at gauging how things are, right? We tend to be biased, and to your point, we may sugarcoat things. We don't necessarily always present them in a way that's accurate. By collecting data through an engagement survey, you're able to really say, this is where we are versus this is where we're going, and see, has change actually happened? Doing, let's say, a focus group is great. You get some really good information. It could be really, really valuable, but it's very difficult to see, have things improved through something like a focus group, because there's not that numeric data to show change over time.
That's exactly right. So Pete, you want to take us through this next slide?
Yeah, absolutely. So like we were saying before, engagement surveys give organizations an opportunity to really dig into the organization and figure out, well, what's going on. And especially recently, but we've been doing this for quite a long time, companies like to investigate differences by the various diversity segments, right? We'll look at age, we'll look at race, we'll look at gender, we'll look at sexual orientation, we'll look at disability status, we'll look at veteran status. There's all different demographics that we apply to engagement surveys. And I do want to point out that since all the George Floyd stuff and all the social injustices that we've been seeing over the last year, this has become not just something in the United States, but we're seeing this across the world. I've been getting involved in a lot more diversity inclusion analyses in Canada than I've ever done. And I've been getting calls from companies around the world, the UK and Ireland and Asia. I've been getting a lot of phone calls about really expanding diversity inclusion beyond just our limited view in the United States, which is wonderful. The one thing, though, that's been a little upsetting to me is most of the companies I do work with, which is great, they like to do gender analysis. So about 90% of the companies that I do work with will have me do a gender cut. Let's see how the differences are between men and women. Are there differences there? I got about 75% of companies asking questions around diversity in terms of race and ethnicity. Now, it varies around the world based on how we ask these questions of race, ethnicity. Some organizations just ask it in terms of minority versus non-minority, or some organizations will ask about specific diversity segments. But I did get about 75% of companies will want to investigate and look at data cuts by racial groups to see, are we having a similar experience across the board within our population? But what's upsetting for me is this data point on the right-hand side. Only about 4% of companies have been investigating disability as a diversity segment. And by the way, this has been consistent over time. When Meg and I started doing this, it was, Meg, like 12, 15 years ago, that number was about 4%. And even to today, that number still remains about 4%. Now, the good news is recently we've been getting more calls for this just in the last 6 months to a year. So I'm hoping that this will explode a little bit more. But 4% is a very, very small number that I'd really like to see changed.
Yeah, definitely. So as you can see, that was really the impetus for us to begin studying this data and find out the story of engagement for employees with disabilities. So we know the percentages of company investigating this is small, but over our 10 years worth of data, we captured over 12 million data sets. And so the differences are really dramatic. So you'll see the chart on the left-hand side that has a 13 percentage point difference on this question. The question is, I have freedom to use my judgment in getting my job done. People with no disabilities rated that 86%, and people without disabilities 73%. So we know people with disabilities often feel micromanaged. They feel there's a lack of trust in their decision making in the workplace. So that's why we think we see this incredible difference. And then on the right, similar and of course connected, employees can express their ideas/views without negative consequences. This had a 12 percentage point difference. So employees with no disabilities at 69%, employees with disabilities at 57%. So not a great score across the board,
Right.
but a dramatically different score for people with disabilities. So they feel there's a greater risk for sharing ideas or expressing opinions or coming up with things that are new and innovative.
Yep.
Pete, anything you want to share about this?
Yeah, so these are some of the biggest differences that we see for disabled versus non-disabled, these two questions. And it's really the most upsetting from my point of view is because it speaks to how much employees with disabilities feel that their work and their opinions are valued. And that's really a critical part of this. Now, one thing I do want to point out about our data, how did we get whether or not someone was disabled or not? We asked this as a question on the survey. And the question is, do you have an apparent or non-apparent disability? And the responses are yes, no, or prefer not to say. So these are people who are self-identifying whether or not they have a disability. Keep in mind, this does not speak to whether or not they've disclosed this information to the organization or not. And that is what's really interesting to me. There's this pervasive feeling that I'm not valued for my contributions as much as someone without a disability. And these are very, very big differences.
Yeah, it's one of those things we went in it with the assumption of, oh, there are probably going to be some differences, but we were really surprised how dramatic those differences were. So Pete, why don't you take us through the next couple, which also have some dramatic differences?
Yep. Yeah, so we go a little bit deeper this time. The question on the left is, I receive recognition from management when I do a good job. There's a 12% difference between these groups. Again, another really big difference like we saw on the previous page. Employees with no disabilities, 68% favorable. Whereas if I look at on the right-hand side, these are employees with disabilities, 56% favorable. So only about half of people half of the people with disabilities feel that they're getting recognized when they do a good job. Again, it speaks to what I said on the previous page. They're not valued as much for their contribution. And in fact, it makes sense that the next question on the right-hand side would also be pretty low. Now, it's not as low, but still 9-point difference is pretty dramatic. Employees with no disability, 73, and people with disabilities, 64. There's a 9-point difference in the question, my company takes an interest in the well-being of its employees. Now, what's interesting about these two questions, if you notice the question on the left is about I, where the question on the right is not about I, it's about employees in general. So employees with disabilities feel like the well-being of employees in general is really not being taken into consideration. It's a greater, more pervasive attitude with the employees with disability. They're having a very different experience at work.
Yeah, and it's, as an HR professional, that hurts my heart, I have to say.
Yeah.
So we did have a few questions that showed little differences, or the differences were less. So we wanted to share those as well too, that really demonstrates the spectrum of what this study covered. Oh, and by the way, this is just highlights from the full report. You can get the full report. It's a free download on our website. So just go to globaldisabilityinclusion.com. There's a green button at the top that says our latest report. Feel free to click it for a download. You can have full access to the data. But at the chart on the right, I feel my career goals can be met at my company. This had a 7 percentage point difference. So employees with no disabilities rated that 71%, and employees with a disability rated that 64%. So certainly less than what we were seeing on the previous slides, where we were seeing 12 and 13 percentage differences, but still this is considered a call to action. So you have just over 60% of employees with a disability that feel their career goals can be met. And we know a lot of times, and we hear from people with disabilities in our work, that you can get pigeonholed in a role, and people will see you being stuck in that role, or you feel you're stuck in that role forever without a lot of advancement opportunities. So we know that can be a problem for employees in general, as well as employees with disabilities. So it tends to be slightly more pervasive.
Mm-hmm.
The chart on the right, my company has created an environment where people of diverse backgrounds can succeed. So this is a little bit better, again, also connected to the question on the left about career goals. So we saw an 8 percentage point difference here. Employees with no disabilities rated this 85%, while employees with a disability, 77%. So overall, the scores are not terrible, but we see that a gap again between employees with disabilities and employees without disabilities.
Mm-hmm.
Pete, you want to take us through the next one?
Sure. So now we're looking at, at the beginning, the questions were more about what's the treatment from the company and how it's impacting people in general. Now we're getting to some of the smaller differences that we're seeing here. So this is what's in front of us. If you look at on the left-hand side, I am treated with respect and dignity, right? This is not about people in general. This is about me. And it's only a 5-point difference, but again, still the difference remains. That there's this different experience that employees with disabilities are having. Now, this question tends to be rated a lot more as it's related to my local environment, meaning the people I work with on a daily basis. And by the way, when I say local, that no longer means physical local. That means virtual local. So the people who are in my workspace that I work with on a regular basis. There's a 5-point difference. We're going to speak to this a little bit later, that the more comfortable employees with disabilities have, the better their scores are. So the local environment are more likely to have people who they've disclosed to. And we'll talk about that and pick apart that a little bit later and why this is a critical part of this. But on the right-hand side, the amount of work expected of me is reasonable. There's a 6-point difference there. 70 for employees without, and then 64 for employees with a disability. So what's causing these differences is one of the questions that starts going through my mind. And some of the things I think about is, if I have an apparent or non-apparent disability, more importantly, if I don't have an apparent disability, maybe the work that's given to me is a little bit harder because I don't necessarily have the accommodations because I haven't requested them and I'm afraid of disclosing that. I have this one example that I talk about with one of my employees, and I've been doing this about 7-8 years ago. I was talking to her about the research that I've been doing on employees with disabilities. And as I was showing it on the screen to her, she said, "Oh, can you make that a little bit bigger? I can't see it." And I said, I'm kind of surprised. You're doing a small screen. She said, "No, it says I have really bad eyesight and it's very difficult for me, and I have to make the screen resolution really big so I can see it." And I'm like, oh, I never realized that before. I said, well, this could be considered a disability, and I can get you a larger screen for it. And it was only through that interaction and that conversation that I had with her that she realized, wow, A, I do have a disability, and B, there's something we could do about it to make things better. So she was actually able to get more work done simply because she had a larger screen and it made it easier for her to get her work done. By the way, a little bit side note about this. During COVID, we've seen employees with disabilities having actually a more positive experience with this work from home because they were able to have more accommodations at home, because usually people's home life has been specifically prescripted for their purposes. So it's actually been a little bit of an uplift for employees with disabilities.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how these questions fare out in the coming year, Pete, especially as we have, companies that are long-term going to work remote. We have hybrid models. We have return-to-work models. So it'll be interesting to see these questions evolve as our world of work has shifted dramatically.
Absolutely. So
Pete, why don't you take us through this one too? I know you talked about it a little bit already, but I know I, for one, was really surprised when hearing it was just the 5 percentage point difference.
Yeah. So if you think about every bar chart we showed, they're all in terms of percentages. So the absolute maximum you could have on any one of those scales is 100%. Well, you guys probably remember back in college or even in high school, we used an alpha level of 0.05. That is, a 5% difference is considered a notable or significant difference. So that's what we use for these results. And what's interesting is almost every question that we asked on this survey showed a difference between those with disabilities and those without. So a 5% difference is considered a notable difference and a call to action. Now, what's most interesting for me, especially given what I've been telling you guys about 2020 has really seen a very large uptick in diversity and inclusion analysis, looking at age and race and gender and whatnot, as well as sexual orientation, as well as disability status. When I look at engagement overall, now, keep in mind, this isn't every question. This is only the engagement, specific engagement questions that measure the outcome of engagement, which are questions like, overall, I'm proud to work for this organization. I am motivated to go up and beyond. I would recommend this company as a place to work. I'm committed to this organization. Those kind of engagement outcome questions. What's really interesting is I do not see any notable differences, no differences that are 5 points or more by age. I don't see any questions in outcomes of engagement that are different by race. In fact, usually I see a slight uptick that usually Black responses are a little bit higher than white responses, and Latino responses also tend to be a little bit higher than white responses. So I don't see any engagement differences by race. I rarely ever see differences by gender. And when I look across my entire database, there are no differences by gender. And even when I look at sexual orientation, when I look at differences based on heterosexual, homosexual, and bisexual populations, I do not see any notable differences. Yet absolutely every time I was looking at these data, looking at disability, I see at least a 5% difference. The differences range from 6% to around 8 or 9%, depending on the year. And what's most intriguing to me, and the whole reason why I started doing this research to begin with, is why is it that the biggest difference I'm seeing based on demographics, no one's talking about? And I've seen it consistently year after year. In fact, one of the things, it makes me sound smart because I tell my company that I work with, hey, you really should ask disability status. Like, oh, we don't think we have a problem there. And I know you're going to measure it and you're going to see a big difference because I haven't yet come across a company that doesn't have at least a 5 percentage point difference the first time they start looking at disability status.
Yeah, and it's so telling, right? People with disabilities are the largest minority group. It's 15% of the global population, 1.3 billion people. In the US, those numbers actually go up to 26%. So
Right.
we know just by those statistics that 15 to 20% of your employee population are likely people with disabilities, both visible and invisible disabilities. So while this seems like a bad news story that Pete and I are sharing, it really is a good news story because there is a part of your employee population you don't understand and are not investigating. So when we talk about the opportunity here to really understand your employees with disabilities and create policies, programs, procedures that will work for them, we know when you design for disability, it's actually better for everybody. So think of the things like curb cuts and automatic manual doors. We all use them. So when you create a product, a program, a service that includes people with disabilities, it's actually better for everybody. So the opportunity here can't be, left aside because 15 to 20%, that's huge.
Yep. And to that point, by doing more work for employees with disabilities, those people who don't recognize, I think one of the biggest problems I have with identifying as an employee with disabilities, a lot of people don't recognize that they're actually part of the group. And to the point that I brought up earlier, my friend had a serious vision problem that we didn't know about it. And when we started talking about it, I said, we could definitely have accommodations for you. And she's like, oh, wow, I never really thought of it that way. And now she does identify as having a disability. Now, it hasn't changed really anything else, but now because we've been able to get her larger monitors and, working with her individually, we know that, sometimes, Michelle can't see it as well as the rest of us. So we make sure that, we're using larger fonts if possible. We don't get too small with things. We take that in consideration when we build decks for her. It just has a real positive impact.
Yeah. I mean, it's so important because there's so many people that, like you said, they just consider, oh, life happens. I happen to have this condition. So it's so important to help shifting that perspective. So two questions have come up I want to address real quick. One, will we receive a copy of these slides? If you guys would like a copy of the slides, you can contact Anne at globaldisabilityinclusion.com, and we will send you a copy. This presentation will also appear on our website and our YouTube channel, so you'll have access to the complete recording as well, too. And then, Pete, there's a question here for you. Pete, that is interesting.
Yeah,
you see it?
This is an excellent question. So the question is, Pete, this is interesting. When you say you don't see differences by age, race, et cetera, is that at the individual org level, across all of your data, or both? So let me clarify this, because I do get this a lot. So number one, I do see differences by, let's say, race and gender when I go deeper into the data, looking at different questions. So for instance, questions of fair pay may be something that I'll see differences showing up by race or gender, or questions by overall fair treatment, or questions about diverse backgrounds can succeed. I will see differences in organizations for those questions, and I do see that to a certain extent in my overall database. When I'm saying I don't see real differences, it's by the engagement outcome. So people, and actually this is an excellent story, for all the various groups, they all feel equally committed to the organization. That's huge, that we're all beating to the same drum. That is a wonderful finding. But for some reason, we're leaving employees with disabilities out of that equation. And actually, it's a good segue to the next slide. Meg, you want to move on to the next slide? So you have to beg the question. It's like, wait a minute, Pete, you just said to me that there's no differences for all of these groups, but there are for disability. And we know that it's not like we're doing such an amazing job on diversity and inclusion in the organizations that there is no differences here. What's going on with this disability group? So one of the questions is, you know what, Pete, if you have a disability, it's harder to work. right? There needs to be accommodation. I mean, my friend needed a larger screen, and it's harder for her to work than it is for me. Maybe it's just the experience of living is harder for employees with disabilities, and thereby it'll be harder with someone with disabilities in the workplace, which is, you know, as a scientist, I can't dispel that hypothesis. So I decided to investigate it. And I said, well, let's think about this. Are there places where employees with disabilities are pretty much the same as those without? So I looked at the new hire data. Now, I've been doing employee engagement work for the last 20 years. I know that people start incredibly high in terms of their scores when they first get hired into a job. And then I know it decreases until about 5 to 7 years, right? The whole 7-year itch thing. That's when I see some of the lowest scores. And then the scores start creeping back up, never exactly reaching the new hire, but getting much higher. New hires that are disabled versus those without disability, I do not see any significant difference between these two groups. Think about that. There is no difference for employees with disabilities and those without disabilities when they first get hired. Yet what happens is over time, there's more of a discrepancy between the two populations. I will see the employees with disabilities decreasing at a greater pace than those without disability. And then we have to ask the question, why is this happening? There's something about the experience that they're having at work that's causing this, right? Is it maybe that they're disclosing and they feel like negative consequences are having by disclosing? By the way, it's a hypothesis. I don't know. I can't test it yet. We'll get to when we can test it. I haven't been able to test that yet based on the questions I have available. Or maybe it's something internal. Maybe it's that those people who aren't disclosing are feeling like they're being excluded, or maybe they can't perform to the level that they would like to. And maybe that's why there's a difference. Or maybe it's just as simple, if I don't feel like I could be myself, if I feel like I'm always hiding something from the organization, maybe that is what's causing that difference over time. Now, these are all good working hypotheses. I haven't yet been able to test. However, I do believe that part of the solution to these differences is creating a greater opportunity for disclosure and acceptance into the organization. One of the things I love about all the inclusion research that's going on is I believe everyone should be included. I don't think inclusion research should not only be about women or certain races or maybe certain ages. Inclusion research is that everyone feels that they can contribute to the best of their ability. And allowing people to disclose will have a really, I believe, will have a really strong impact on that.
Yeah, and we know it's happening. Yeah, I was just going to say, we know that's happening already. I mean, with the onset of Section 503 in the U.S., it has actually driven the global conversation about disability disclosure in the workplace. And companies had to get smart and are getting smart on how to have those conversations about disability in the workplace and what supports people might need. So we're already seeing that shift happening from don't ask, don't tell to being loud and proud about your disability and what you need in the workplace. So we're seeing that shift. So you're so right. This will be interesting to watch over time, given those shifts in disability conversations, as well as the way we are now working, how those numbers will shift. So I'm excited. So yeah, we get this question all the time. Can we make a difference? So Pete, this is one of your case studies. So can you share with us what happened?
Yeah, so getting back to what I'd mentioned before, people are saying to me, well, Pete, maybe it's you can't help people with disabilities. They're just going to be unhappy and there's nothing we can do about it. And I say, well, let's test this. So I worked with some company for a number of years, and I was really excited because they started asking about disability based on my recommendation. They said, oh, I don't think we're going to have a difference here. And we asked the question, sure enough, there was a 6-point difference. Those without disabilities got a 77 on overall engagement, and those with disabilities got a 71%. And the guy was flabbergasted. He couldn't believe that there was a difference. He said, well, we got to do something about this. So he was a very strong leader on diversity and inclusion. And by the way, this isn't a small company. This company at the time had 16,000 employees. So to see a big difference like this over this length of time is huge. But they decided to really very strongly push on making sure people with disabilities felt included, making sure that their needs were being met, that they were part of the diversity and inclusion method. And what happened is they shaved it off. And at time 2, they shaved off 2 points, and now the difference was only 4 points. And then they continued to work on this. And then they moved down and reduced a little bit more, so that after the 3-year study that we did with them, they had reduced it down to a 3-point difference. Now, I want that difference to be 0 at some point, but at least we were able to make the difference by attending to their needs, by recognizing the importance of their contribution and making mention to that. That caused this big difference.
Yeah, you can't track what you don't measure, and you can't make progress against something you're not measuring, right? So
exactly.
It's such an important message. Well, we wanted to share.
Wait, hold on, real quick, Meg, before you go there, we have another question. Let me just hit this question. So, Brian, in the study, did you classify individuals with a neurodivergent disorder as having a disability, and is this population being included in the overall 15 to 20%? Let me hit the first part of it, and Meg, you could hit the second part of it. The first part of it is, no, we weren't able to classify based on neurodivergent. The question, as I said before, was, do you have an apparent or non-apparent disability? Now, it's up to the individual to define whether or not they consider anything that they have as a disability. Now, we're going to be talking about this Amplify survey in a little bit, which will help us dig down into some of that question. But no, for the purposes of this study, it did not include that. And Meg, do you want to talk about the second half? Is this included in the 15 to 20?
Yes, it is included in the 15 to 20.
Okay. I figured that was it, but I didn't want to take away your steam.
Yeah, so the 15 to 20% numbers are the ones that we have gotten from the World Health Organization that is cross-disability, includes all disabilities. We also look to the CDC data, of course, the UN and other global organizations that are really leading in the stats and numbers of people with disabilities. So we work with all people with disabilities. We encourage companies to hire all people with disabilities. So, we include everybody. So I wanted to share, because we do get questions a lot, like, well, what are innovative companies doing? And there are a couple I wanted to share here that I think are really stellar in our space in general as companies, but are doing some really interesting things in disability inclusion. So I think it's important to note neither of these 2 companies were that case study that we just saw. So these are just a couple of companies that are doing cool stuff that we like. So Microsoft, obviously, hands down, innovative company, but they've got a couple of things that are happening that are really leading the way. They have a chief accessibility officer who is a person who is deaf. Sign language is her primary form of communication. She reports directly to the CEO. So this is an organization that has prioritized disability inclusion at one of its most senior levels. So this office that she runs focuses on both employees with disabilities as well as customers with disabilities. Obviously, we're all glued to our computers, so access, for customers is really important to Microsoft. And every year they get questions or problems stated by people with disabilities, and if they don't have answers to them, they host annual hackathons. Actually, I think they happen twice a year now, where they bring coders in and solve some of the biggest problems that are facing, people with disabilities. So, of course, they have infrastructure supports, business resource groups, and they're also helping to drive change for the industry as a whole. So if you go to Microsoft's website, and I think it's just microsoft.com/accessibility, you get a whole page of resources and videos and information and tips and tools. So they're really driving change, not only within their company, but across the world in how people think about access and inclusion of people with disabilities. So we like them a lot. They're one of our favorites. We love the folks over there, and they're really doing innovative stuff. So definitely one to keep an eye on. The other one that we like a lot too is Northrop Grumman, and they really focused on infrastructure. So they did a couple of things, you know, centralizing the accommodations process. They have a self-ID campaign that runs every year, encouraging people to disclose their disability status. They've upped their recruitment at colleges and universities for students with disabilities. So they're really trying to get at what does that employee population look like and how can they support them. They have 9 pillars across their inclusion framework, and they made sure they understood how disability was going to touch in each one of those. So it became embedded in the overall diversity initiatives of the program. So like 2 programs that are a little bit different but have some similarities in making sure there's a thread across the business. Both of them have these, and so just a couple of ideas for you guys if you're looking for some things to do to amp up your disability inclusion program. So what Pete and I have been up to since finding this data and studying it over the last 10 years, we found that there's a gap, there's a knowledge gap for companies. They don't understand their employees with disabilities. So we've created the first ever disability climate and culture survey. It is called Amplify. We want you to amplify your disability inclusion program. And this will not take place of your large strategic surveys that companies put out there, but this is a way to obtain a baseline of your employees with disabilities and understand where there are gaps. So we will ask questions of both employees with disabilities and employees without, so we can compare to our existing data set, right? We will ask, you know, as defined by the Americans with Disabilities Act, the CRPD, and various other definitions of disability. Do you qualify as a person with a disability? And we'll give examples of some, you know, visible and invisible conditions that would apply. And then if you're not a person, you'll be asked, are you a colleague, an advocate, an ally, a coworker of someone with a disability? So the first, say, 35 or so questions will be the same, and we'll cover the first 6 areas. Diversity and equity, similar to the questions that you saw earlier, right? Enablers and resources, climate, culture, your leadership, your ability to achieve. Are you able to bring your whole self to work? Those things. But where the questions will get different is around disability inclusion. So the employee with a disability will get questions about, have you disclosed your disability at work? Did you feel comfortable doing so? Do you regret disclosing your disability at work? Was it easy to get an accommodations process? Did you have to provide medical paperwork or medical documentation of your disability? Things like that are going to be very specific about their experience. The employees without a disability will get questions like, I see examples of my disabled colleagues being treated with dignity and respect. I see examples of senior leadership talking about disability inclusion in the same ways they talk about other diversity initiatives. So the idea here, you're getting at both the reality of the lived experience of someone with a disability and the perceptions of their colleagues. So this will provide real actionable results for companies. So the survey is going to launch. We have our first round coming up next month, September 2nd to the 17th. And folks will get results just in time for Disability Employment Awareness Month, or in the middle of it. And then we've gotten a lot of companies that said, we want to do this, but September's not going to work for us. So we created a second round, which is going to be February 14th to March 4th. So we're really excited about that. And we've gotten a lot of great interest for some of the best brands that you have heard of around the globe, which is really exciting. So we are getting questions, what do we get? How does this work? So obviously we are partnering with Mercer on this. This will go into their database. You will get, each company who signs up to participate in the survey will get a dedicated survey link that is just yours. And so that makes it easy to send out to the employees, whether it's a letter from the CEO or it's on the internet or it comes out in a newsletter or all of the above. It makes it really easy for folks to also share the link within the company, et cetera. So you can really make sure that you're upping your participation percentages. You get access to the full data set, so you will see all of the final results. Pete and I will pull together a summary of findings similar to what you've seen here, some of your largest difference, some of your lower differences, and then we'll spend an hour with each company and just kind of walk through the highlights and discuss recommendations, industry trends that we're seeing, and really help you understand where you are. Additionally, each company that signs up will be benchmarked against the 12 million data set. So not only will you get results for your company, you will also get results compared to our existing data set. So you can see where you fall into it globally. And then, of course, we get lots of questions. People like to work with me and Pete on some of their findings and rolling things out. So that would be an option for folks too if they wanted to engage in that way. So we are super excited about this survey. We think that it is really going to give companies the next evolution of where they need to go and the data, and that's their employee experience and understanding how they can create a better climate and culture. So I know we just got about 12 minutes left. So Pete, if you have any final thoughts on that you want to add, give me those, and then we'll take questions, comments, and just have a discussion.
Yeah, so there's a couple of questions here that I could speak to, but before I get into that, just real quick, I think, what's most important for me, and the reason why Meg and I are doing this is, if you guys want to partner with us, that's fantastic. We would love it, but we want to get people to start moving the dial. We want them to start asking these questions within their firms. If your organization is not asking about disability status, why not? And then what goodness can we do by asking these questions? Just like I showed you the example of the one company that had that 6-point difference and brought it down to 3. They were really surprised that there was a difference. And what I love about my job is I go to CEOs and heads of HR and I point out to them, these are the people in your organization who haven't felt connected. We need to make them feel more connected and to show them a proportion of their organization, a large proportion of their organization, who have been systematically kept out of the conversation and they're not able to have the same experience. Well, that's huge, and they love getting this feedback. So I'd really encourage all of you to start asking these questions in your engagement survey, start investing in it, and to Meg's point, and of course I believe in this as well, if you're not measuring it, then you're not capturing it. You don't really know what's going on. So one question that came up by Sylvia was, have you done any analysis in Mexican companies or transnational companies established in Mexico? So I can't speak specifically to Mexico, but in 2014, Meg and I presented at a conference on international results. The bad news is the problem is consistent around the world, that employees with disabilities basically aren't feeling the love of the organization. It does vary quite a bit according to the culture. There are certain cultures where having a disability is seen as like a strike against you as a person. It's not something that, I was born with and it's okay, I can get around it. It's more about, no, this speaks more about who you are, and it's a little bit more of an embarrassment. Happily, it seems like a lot of that is going away, but we did find pretty large differences around the world. I'll have to look at my database and see if I have anything specific in Mexico, but I haven't really looked at a country level. So the next question, do you have any data on the benefit in hiring people with disability to promote engagement and hiring? So Meg, do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, good question. And probably the data that we have is in a couple of long-ranging studies that have been out there. So Walgreens in the US was one of the first companies to actually track and measure the success of employing people with disabilities. And they did it over a 5-year period. So that came out, it's in Safety and Management magazine. You can find it, I'm sure, from a quick Google search. But they talked about over time how it really helped their overall climate and culture. There was less complaining in the workplace. People were trying harder. The teamwork was better because when they saw maybe an employee with disability needed a little assistance, they were happy to lend a hand. So we do see in every instance that it does have a positive impact on the corporate culture and the climate. We see decrease in absenteeism for both because people with disabilities are absent 40% less than their non-disabled colleagues. So that starts to, come into the organization. Other people going, oh, well, they're showing up. Oh, I'm going to show up too. I can't be the one not coming in. So we do see that data across studies. And then there are videos that Walgreens has put out. They were one of the first ones talking about the positive impact it had on their leadership to be better managers. So there are lots from the Walgreens story, and I like there so much because there is such a vast amount of data. But just a quick Google search, you can probably find plenty of others as well. Do we have any other comments or questions?
Yeah, so one question came up is how can we partner with you? The simplest way is you guys can see our email addresses on this page. Feel free, and I mean this sincerely, reach out to us directly through email. You can also find us on LinkedIn if you guys want to link to other presentations and whatnot that we're doing. We're more than happy to have you guys follow us. Just so you're aware, I'm in the process of analyzing a little bit more data. The data that we're reporting to you guys is through, I think it was 2018, and I have a couple more years I want to add to this. So we're probably going to be doing another cut of this data at the end of the year. And at that point, to the person who asked about, how much of this work we've done with Mexico, we're going to be doing a deeper dive into demographic cuts, more so than we ever did before. One other really strong way that I'd love for people to partner with us is take the Amplify survey. One of the reasons I'm so excited about this is you can imagine, Meg and I have been collecting these data for the last 15 years, and we still have it in our questions. Why? We can't fully answer why yet the way we would like, and Amplify will help me get that information. And once I get that information, I want to share it with the world so we can create a difference. So please, sign up for the Amplify survey. It's not too late to get into the September one. We could probably just get you guys under the wire. If you can't do it as soon as September, more than happy to have you guys join up in February.
Yeah, absolutely. And I see a question here about, do we do work in local state VR agencies to assist with available resources? Yes, we do. We do partner with VR agencies and other disability community service providers because in many instances we can't be everywhere that our clients are. We do reach out to organizations in each of the states. Of course, VR is usually the hub, right? And say, oh, we have clients in this location. Can you help them find individuals with disabilities? And we actually encourage that local relationship to really foster and develop. So yeah, we do work with a lot of the business engagement teams and our client work. So we've got a client we're working with right now that has is a large retailer, and we are in over 25 cities with them. So yeah, we've been spending a lot of time with our friends at VR helping us out on that one. Any other questions? We got a couple of minutes left, so there's still some time to take some questions. All right, well, I guess everybody's ready for either a late lunch or a second cup of coffee, depending on what, or, you know, a cocktail, depending on what part of the world you joined us from. So we'll let everybody have a few minutes back. Luke, I think we're done, unless anybody wants to chime in for one last question. Oh, Sylvia, yes. I think you sent me an email, and I have tried twice to respond to you, and it keeps saying that your server is full. So not sure how else we can communicate because I can't seem to email you back. And we would love to hear what's going on in Mexico.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, then I think that's it. Luke, if you can bring this home, I'd appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Meg. And this concludes today's Global Disability Inclusion webinar. Thank you, everyone, for attending.